Hey everyone, this segment of notes we are going to focus on the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention. A constitution is a blueprint for the nation. So it's not so much laws and policies as who is going to make those laws, who are going to make those policies, and how are those policies going to be made. What powers are you going to give different groups of people in the government? And our first try at a constitution in the US is called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation did create a Congress, but it did not create a presidency. It did create an army. It did create a united federal government that was allowed to make treaties with other nations. But as far as the overall strength of the federal government, it was very limited. Some of the weaknesses of the articles are listed on the screen. The reason for a weak national government was the colonists or the founding fathers just got out from under the thumbnail of Great Britain, and they felt that they were oppressed during that time, leading right up to the Revolutionary War. Their rights were taken away from them. They didn't have a voice. They didn't have representation. And they blamed this national government in Great Britain for that. Because in Great Britain, all the power was at the national level. You did not have any power at any lower levels of government. So to kind of ensure that you didn't have this all-powerful national government just taking over rights and telling people what to do, they made the national government fairly weak. They didn't have a president, no national courts, which meant you just had the state courts, which also meant you could have inconsistencies among rulings and among judicial processes. There was no national currency, so each state may have its own type of money and coin its own money, which could become problematic as you're moving from state to state. And even though you did have a Congress, a national legislative branch, they were still very limited and weak compared to the Congress that we know today. One of the biggest weaknesses that they had was they didn't have the power to tax. And without the power to tax, you have a national government that doesn't really have any resources or tools. And this is actually why it's called Articles of Confederation. A confederation is a type of government where the power rests at state levels primarily, not at a national level. The Articles of Confederation were not all bad. With it, we did have the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, and it extended the land to the Mississippi River. This made the United States a country that was 10 times the size of Great Britain, which meant we had a variety of resources and kind of got us off on really good foot economically speaking, just as far as the resources we have available and the different economic activities that we could pursue as a new nation to build our economy and to build our strength. Some other positives were a couple of ordinances. You have the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And as we progress west, it's just creating this process as to how are we going to admit new states into the United States, because at the time of our independence, we were 13 colonies. But by gaining this land up to the Mississippi, it did create more territory for us to occupy. So it set guidelines and protocol as to what does that look like, how are we going to deal with slavery, and it was something that was utilized even after the Articles of Confederation didn't exist anymore. So with such a weak Congress and a weak national government, no courts, no presidency, and one of the reasons they didn't want a president was because they felt like a president was too king-like. It made them think of this one central authority that could, once again, infringe on their rights. And they didn't want a president to become like a king or like a dictator. So they just didn't have that position at all in the Articles of Confederation. Now, of course, the Articles of Confederation don't exist anymore. We just have the U.S. Constitution is the Constitution we utilize today. So one of kind of the tipping points that the Founding Fathers experienced or that happened in our country that made the Founding Fathers realize that maybe this isn't going to work. Maybe we do need a new system, a new constitution, or just revise the articles, give the national government a little bit more power was Shays' Rebellion. You had a lot of war debt after the Revolutionary War. So even though you didn't have a national government collecting taxes, you still had state governments collecting taxes. So due to a lot of war debt, the states were imposing high taxes on their citizens, which, if you think about it, is kind of ironic because an increase of taxes is one of the things that the colonists complained about and got their independence from Great Britain. Granted, they felt like they weren't represented in Parliament, so there was another element to it. But you did have high taxes being imposed on citizens within states at that particular time. You have people like Daniel Shay. He was a farmer. He couldn't pay those high taxes. And when that happened, a lot of states, a lot of times, would take your farms. So Daniel Shay lost his farm. The state repossessed it, due to the fact that he couldn't pay his taxes. So that spurred a rebellion. And the reason this is such a big deal and a pivotal point for the Founding Fathers was this is a group of farmers who had their land taken away. And they marched and they occupied government buildings and shut down those government buildings so that no more notices could be sent out to take land. And again, this is just a group of private citizens, a group of farmers. And they're able to shut down certain aspects of the state government. And the government had a hard time stopping them. And the national government was unable to stop them. It actually ended up taking private citizens to shut down the rebellion. You had a very wealthy man just hire his own little militia to disperse the farmers who were rebelling and allowing the government buildings to reopen. So the idea kind of is if the national government can't squash this rebellion of poor farmers, well, what's going to happen when Great Britain wants to take some of the land back that it had lost? So it left us very vulnerable, the articles did, without giving the national government a lot of leverage and a lot of power. So they did realize that something had to be done. The national government did need to be strengthened in order to protect the nation as a whole. So with that, you do have the Constitutional Convention. But before we move to that slide, you kind of have this divide occur among our founding fathers and among your prominent leaders of the new nation. Do we keep the Articles of Confederation? Do we revise them? Do we create this new constitution? You had a lot of people in favor of the Articles still. A lot of people in favor of the states having most of the power and not a national government. So you did have this partisan divide occur and between a group of Federalists who wanted a new constitution, who wanted to give more power to the national government, and the anti-Federalists who wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation intact, perhaps revise them a bit, but the heart and soul of them, which is power at the state level, they wanted to maintain that because they believed that states knew the needs of their citizens better. So it makes more sense to pay more state taxes because the states will utilize that money in a way that the citizens of that state needs. Whereas a big national government, it doesn't know what citizens need on a more personal level. Okay, they see the national government as far removed from citizen needs and understanding the needs of the citizens. And again, a fear that they will abuse the rights and liberties of citizens as well. So you kind of have this partisan divide occur around this time period as well. You do end up having a convention. However, originally, the convention was called to just revise the articles. So everyone was kind of in agreement that we're going to strengthen this document. We're going to ensure that we can keep the country safe, keep the citizens safe, while still maintaining the liberties and the rights of the people and power at the state level. They realized, however, that that was a lot easier said than done, and they ended up throwing out the entire document and starting over from scratch. So you do have this meeting of 55 of your more prominent leaders of your new nation, your typical founding fathers who you think of when you think of founding fathers: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. You had a good representation of large states and small states, states where slavery was very prominent and states where slavery was not so prominent. And because of that, you had a lot of headbutting during the Constitutional Convention because southern states, slave states, they felt they had different needs than northern states and states that did not utilize slavery as much. And small states were fighting for representation and to be heard, whereas large states felt like they should be heard more because they have a larger population. So you did have a lot of instances where you had the convention just nearly end because these 55 men had a hard time agreeing. Because I think these are leaders and they're used to leading. And now you get a room full of 55 leaders in the room having to compromise, and not everyone's going to get their way. People are going to come to blows, and it's going to take a lot of work to get them to agree on some things. All right. So the first problem is the problem of representation. We are going to be a representative democracy, which we've talked about in class before. Due to the size of our country, being a direct democracy is just not viable. We're too large. There's too many people. It would take forever to get policies created if people individually voted on every law and every policy themselves. So we are a representative democracy. We vote on the people to make the policies on our behalf. So the question is, how many representatives would each state get to send to Congress? So in North Carolina, you don't get to vote on your policies, you don't get to vote on your laws directly, but you get to vote on the representatives and the senators that sit in Congress and make those policies for you. So how many are going to be sitting in Congress from North Carolina? How many are we going to send to be our voice and to vote on our behalf? And the more people representing your state, the larger your voting power is. So this question actually almost ended the convention. You had the large states and the small states not agreeing on, what this is going to look like. So some possible solutions that existed. One, representation based on population. Larger states favored this option, and this is known as the Virginia plan, because, it makes sense. If we are a direct democracy, for example, then let's take modern day, for instance. California, more people are going to be voting than in Rhode Island. That's just the fact. So you're going to have literally more votes come out of California on policies than you are in Rhode Island because of the number of people. So California should have more representatives than Rhode Island. And that's how the large states saw it. And again, this was the Virginia plan. And Virginia at the time was the largest state in the Union. The second solution was one that the smaller states favored, and it was called the New Jersey plan. And it was the belief that there should be an equal number of representatives from each state. So one per state. Everyone gets a vote. Everyone gets heard equally. Of course, the larger states did not feel like this was fair and felt like they would be underrepresented due to their population and their size. And then create a Congress with two parts. We call that bicameral. And redraw boundaries of each state so that population was equal in all states. All right. So the solution was what we call the Great Compromise. Another name for the Great Compromise is the Connecticut Compromise. You'll probably see if this ends up on an NCFE, they'll probably use the Great Compromise and put the Connecticut Compromise in parentheses. But just in case, it's also called the Connecticut Compromise. So that kind of goes back over what we already talked about, large states versus small states and what they each wanted. So you don't necessarily have to look back over that. But the compromise itself was create a bicameral Congress. And the House of Representatives was going to be based on proportional representation. So this came from the Virginia plan. It's going to be based on population. So the number of representatives you send to the House is proportional to your population. The more people you have, the more representatives you get to send. The fewer people, the less. Everyone sends at least one. So today, for instance, your smaller states like Rhode Island, like Montana, which is small in population, like Alaska, they get one representative in Congress. All right. Whereas your larger states, California, being the one with the most people, they send 53 representatives to Congress. That shows you the difference of their population size compared to Alaska and Montana. And North Carolina, for instance, we send 13 representatives to Congress. And we're in the top 11 for number of representatives in Congress, in the House of Representatives. And we'll look more at that in the Senate and the House structure and the congressional structure in Unit 2. So that's one part of Congress. The other part of Congress is the Senate, and that satisfied the smaller states, and it took the elements of the New Jersey plan to give equal representation to each state as well. So you have 2 senators per state, no matter your population. So every state has at least 3 people in Congress, 2 senators and 1 representative. And then some have up to 55, like California, with 53 representatives in the House and 2 senators in the Senate. All right, so that was the biggest. It is called the Great Compromise, but that was the most important compromise that occurred because it did save the convention and it set up the Congress that we utilize today. The second problem kind of spurred as a result of the Great Compromise, and it's how are we going to count the slaves? If you have representation based on population for the House of Representatives, how many people, what is your state's population? How many people are in your state? Do you count the slaves in your state? Or do you just count the citizens in your state? So that was the next big argument. And this was more of a battle between southern states and northern states on how we're going to handle this. So possible solutions are as follows. The South preferred to count each slave, obviously, because you had more slaves in the South than in the North. So it would boost their population numbers and they would get to send more representatives to Congress. So it sounded great to them. States with fewer slaves, however, primarily in the North, saw this as unfair. Slaves were not citizens at the time. Slaves could not vote at the time. Slaves did not have rights at the time. So why would you count slaves in your population head count? If you had a direct democracy, slaves would not be voting on laws and policies. So they should not go towards your head count when you decide how many representatives you should send to Congress. So that was kind of the northern states' viewpoint. So the possible solutions: let each state with slaves decide whether they wanted to be counted, which of course the southern states would say yes. Count 3 out of every 5 states towards population and taxes. Count slaves for taxes but not representation for 30 years. And count slaves for representation but not for taxes for 30 years. All right. And of course, the solution, which you've probably heard, is the 3/5 compromise. So that option number 2 is what they went for. And here's just a recap of what the northern states wanted versus what the southern states wanted. And it was count 3 out of every 5 slaves for taxes and population. So the southern states didn't get to count all of their slaves in their population and their census for representation in Congress, but they got to count some. All right, and that is a compromise. I guess it seems odd to us because, like I said, if it were a direct democracy, they wouldn't have allowed slaves to vote directly. So they're just benefiting from the sheer number of people in their state. But again, the convention had about the same number of northern states or non-slave states and southern slave states. So whether it seems fair or not, you had to come up with a compromise just to keep the convention moving along. All right, finally, we come back around to our Federalists and our Anti-Federalists. So through this convention, you have this new Constitution created, and we're going to study this new Constitution more in depth in Unit 2, because it is the document we still use today to run our government. So it's important that you understand what it says so that you can accurately evaluate and analyze what your government is doing currently. But after they finished at the convention, they had this document, and they decided that in order for it to be ratified or approved, 9 out of the 13 states had to approve it, and then it would take effect. It would be our official document. So if you have 9 states approve it, even if you are missing those 4 other states, it's still the official Constitution of the U.S., and all 13 states have to abide by it because they got the 9. The problem was they did not receive 9 approvals. And this is actually where Mr. Hodges is going to take over with the notes and explaining some of the differences between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist and how they reached a compromise as well in order to get this document ratified. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye.